welcome back to CTEC 203 for a class that I call Media Histories 1, Marxism and Early Communication Theory. And what we're going to be looking at today is the early influence to cultural studies, to media studies, to communication studies of the ideas of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. And then I'm going to follow up with somebody who took on their ideas a little bit later, Antonio Gramsci. And the works that we're going to be reading for today are from Marx and Engels, The Ruling Class and the Ruling Ideas, and from Antonio Gramsci, a work from the Prison Notebooks, 3 sections titled The History of the Subaltern Classes, The Concept of Ideology, Cultural Themes, and Ideological Material. And the intent today is to provide us some idea of the origins of media studies and communication studies and some of the key ideas that fed into what has become those disciplines over time. But I want to start with an overview of Marxism before we move into the readings and the exercises for today. And with a joke. So a young reporter asked a leading capitalist how he had made his fortune, and the young capitalist said this: it was really quite simple. I bought an apple for 5 cents. I spent the evening polishing it and sold it the next day for 10 cents. With this, I bought 2 apples, spent the evening polishing them and sold them for 20. And so it went until I had amassed 80 apples. It was at this point that my wife's father died and left us $1 million. And so here's the joke. And is it true? Is it fair? What does it all mean? I think there are no more hotly contested questions in our society than why some people are rich and others poor, and whether things have to be this way. And I think the joke really calls attention to that. Karl Marx, for his part, sought the answers to these questions by trying to understand how our capitalist society works, for whom it works better, for whom it works worse, how it arose out of feudalism, and where it is likely to lead. And I think these are leading questions for us in the contemporary period as well. So concentrating on the social and economic relations in which people earn their livings, Marx saw behind capitalism's law and order appearance a struggle of 2 main classes: the capitalists, who own the productive resources, and the workers or the proletariat, who must work in order to survive. And Marxism is essentially Marxist analysis of the complex and developing relations between these 2 classes. And it should be noted that these ideas need to be updated for the contemporary period as well, because Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels were writing in the 19th century. But I think the ideas have currency today and need this kind of a rethinking as well, because the idea of class has all but disappeared from social theory, and I think there's a real place for thinking about it now, not only just in terms of in the more simplistic terms that Marx and Engels were talking in the 19th century, but in relation to global migrations in the contemporary period, the incredible amassing of wealth within certain classes, and largely wealth that's paperless as well, and the incredible movements, social movements that have gone on in the past 10 years or so, most recently the Occupy movement, which really calls attention to class issues once again. So there's, I think, a renewed energy around Marxism today. But where does it come from? Now, the main theories that make up this analysis, the theory of alienation, the labor theory of value, and the materialist conception of history, must all be understood with this kind of focus in mind. Even Marx's vision of socialism emerges from his study of capitalism, for socialism is the unrealized potential inherent in capitalism itself. Now, this is something that our great material wealth and advanced forms of organization make possible. For a more and a just and democratic society in which everyone can develop his or her distinctively human qualities. And those are ideas that are repeated in Marx and Engels over and over again. Some socialist ideas can be traced as far back as the Bible, though, but Marxism really takes its main intellectual origins in German philosophy and in English political economy and in French utopian socialism as well. But it's really the German philosopher Friedrich Hegel that Marx learned a way of thinking about the world, its fluid complexity, that's called dialectics. It's really important for Marx as he begins his work and carries through his work as well. But he also draws on British political economists like Adam Smith and David Ricardo, and they provided Marx with a first approximation of a labor theory of value. And then from the French utopians like Charles Fourier and the Comte de Saint-Simon, Marx caught a glimpse of a happier future that lay beyond capitalism, so socialist ideas that were threaded through their work. Now, along with the paradox of an industrial revolution which produced as much poverty as it did wealth, these are really the main ingredients that went into the formation of Marxism. So what then of the actual ideas behind Marx's work? Well, Marx's study of capitalism was grounded in a philosophy that's both dialectical and materialist. With dialectics, changes and interaction are brought into focus and emphasized by being viewed as essential parts of whatever institutions and processes are undergoing change and interaction. So in this way, the study of capitalism, the wider context, is never lost sight of when studying any event within it, an election or an economic crisis, for example. Nor are its real past and future possibilities, the historical context, ever neglected when dealing with how something appears in the present. Whatever Marx's subject of the moment, his dialectical approach to it ensures that his fuller subject is always capitalist society as it developed and is still developing. Now, the actual changes that occur in history are seen here as the outcome of opposing tendencies or contradictions which evolve in the ordinary functioning of society. And so the dialectic is embedded in this notion. Unlike Hegel's dialectic, though, which operates solely on ideas, Marx's dialectic is materialist. Marx was primarily concerned with capitalism as lived rather than thought about, but people's lives also involve consciousness at the same time. So whereas Hegel examined ideas apart from the people who held them, Marx's materialism puts ideas back in the heads of living people and treats both as part of a world that is forever being remade through human activities, particularly through relations of production. Now, in this interaction, social conditions and behavior are found to have a greater effect on character and development of people as ideas than these ideas do on social conditions and behavior. So the forces of production actually produce the conditions and behavior of the people that live under those forces of production. Marx's specific theories are best understood as answers to his pointed questions about the nature and development of capitalism. So he asks, how do the ways in which people earn their living affect their bodies, their minds, and their daily lives? In the Theory of Alienation, Marx gives us his answer to this question. Workers in capitalist society do not own the means, the machines, the raw materials, the factories, which they use in their work. They are owned by the capitalists, to whom the workers must sell their labor or their ability to work in return for a wage. Now, we're all very familiar with this system, so this is how it's theorized. Now, this system of labor displays four relations that lie at the core of Marx's theory of alienation. The first is that the worker is alienated. That is, the worker is cut off from his or her productive activity, playing no part in deciding what to do or how to do it. Someone else, that is, the capitalist, the person who owns the means of production, also sets the conditions and speed of work, and even decides if the worker is to be allowed to work or not, i.e., he or she fires and hires them, or hires and fires them, that should be. The second thing is that the worker is alienated from the product of that activity, having no control over what is made or what happens to it, often not even knowing what happens to it once it's left his or her hands. And the third thing is that the worker is alienated from other human beings, with competition and mutual indifference replacing most forms of cooperation. Now, this applies not only to relations with the capitalists, who use their control over the worker's activity and product to further their own profit-maximizing interests, but also to relations between individuals inside each class, as everyone tries to survive as best he or she can. So the fourth point then is, finally, the worker is alienated from the distinctive potential for creativity and community we all share just because we are human beings. That is a baseline for human life, that is, creativity and community. So through labor, which alienates them from their activity, product, and other people, workers gradually lose their ability to develop the finer qualities which belong to them as members of the human species. So this is serious. The cutting of these relationships in half leaves on one side a seriously diminished individual, physically weakened, mentally confused and mystified, isolated and virtually powerless. On the other side of this separation are the products and ties with other people, outside the control and lost to understanding of the worker. Submitted to the mystification of the marketplace, the worker's products pass from one hand to another, changing form and names along the way. Value, commodity, capital, interest, rent, wage, depending on chiefly who has among them and how they are used, or how these are among them and how they're used. Now, eventually these same products, though no longer seen as such, re-enter the worker's daily life as the landlord's house, the grocer's food, the banker's loan, the boss's factory, and the various laws and customs that prescribes his or her relationships with other people. So unknowingly, the worker has constructed the necessary conditions for reproducing his own alienation. So we can see that kind of circularity within the system that keeps workers always in their place. The world that the worker has made and lost in alienated labor reappears as someone else's private property, which he only has access to by selling his labor power and engaging in alienated labor. Now, though Marx's main examples of alienation are drawn from the life of workers, other classes are also alienated to the degree that they share or are directly affected by these relations, and that actually includes the capitalists themselves. So let me turn to some of the historical tendencies embedded in Marxism. So one of the things that he asks in several of his works is, how did capitalism originate and where is it leading? Now, Marx's materialist conception of history answers the first part of this question with an account of the transformation of feudalism into capitalism. He stresses the contradictions that arose through the growth of towns, population, technology, and trade, which at a certain point burst asunder the feudal social and political forms in which production had been organized. Now, relations of lord to serf based on feudal rights and obligations have become a hindrance to the further development of these productive forces. Over an extended period and after a series of political battles, they were replaced by the contractual relations of capitalists to workers. So with capitalists free to pursue profits wherever they might take them, and workers equally free to sell their labor to capitalists however they might use it, the productive potential inherent in new forces of production, especially in technology and science, grew to unmeasured proportions. However, if maximizing profits leads to rapid growth, when rapid growth results in large profits, then growth is restricted as soon as it becomes unprofitable. Now, the periodic crises which have plagued capitalism from about 1830 on are clear evidence of this. Now, since that time, the new forces of production which have come into being in capitalism, their growth and potential for producing wealth, have come increasingly into contradiction with the capitalist social relations in which production is actually organized. So the capitalists put the factories, the machines, the raw materials, and the labor power, all of which they own, into motion to produce goods only if they feel they can make a profit, no matter what the availability of those factors of production, and no matter what the need of consumers for their product. Now, the cost to society in wealth that is never produced, and in wealth which is produced but in forms that are antisocial in their character, continues to grow, and with it the need for another, more efficient, more humane way of organizing production. Now, within this framework, the actual course of history is determined by class struggle. Now, according to Marx, each class is defined chiefly by its relation to the productive process and has objective interests rooted in that relation. The capitalist's interests lie in securing the power and expanding profits. Workers, on the other hand, have interests in higher wages, in safe working conditions, shorter hours, job security, and because it's required to realize their interests, new distributions of power. So the class struggle involves everything that these two major classes do to promote their incompatible interests at each other's expense. And this is where history is produced for Marx and Engels as well. So in this battle, which rages throughout society, the capitalists are aided by their wealth, their control of the state, and their domination over other institutions, such as school, media, churches, and other institutions as well. And these guide and distort at the same time people's thinking. On the workers' side, on the other hand, are their sheer numbers, their experience of cooperation, however alienated while at work, trade unions, working class political parties where they exist, and the contradictions within capitalism that make present conditions increasingly irrational. So their ability to be a collective is what is on the side of the workers. Now in capitalism, the state is an instrument in the hands of the capitalists that is used to repress dangerous dissent and to help expand surplus value. Now this is done mainly by passing and enforcing anti-working class laws and by providing the capitalists with various economic subsidies, a sort of capitalist welfare, if you will. Marx also views the state as a set of political structures interlocked with the economic structures of capitalism, whose requirements, chiefly for accumulating capital, it must satisfy. Now, if the whole system is not to go into a tailspin, and finally, the state is an arena for class struggle, where class and class factions contend for political advantage in an unfair fight that finds the capitalist holding all the most powerful weapons. An adequate understanding of the role of the capitalist state as a complex social relation requires that it be approached from each of these three angles, then, as an instrument of the capitalist class, as a structure of political offices and processes, and as an arena of class struggle. Now, in order to supplement the institutions of force, capitalism has given rise to an ideology, or a way of thinking, which gets people to accept the status quo, or at least confuses them as to the possibility of replacing it with something better. For the most part, the ideas and concepts which make up this ideology work by getting people to focus on the observable aspects of any event or institution, neglecting its history and potential for change, as well as the broader context in which it resides. The result, then, is a collection of partial, static, distorted, one-sided notions that reveal only what the capitalists would like everyone to think. For example, in capitalist ideologies, consumers are considered sovereign, as if consumers actually determine what gets produced by the choices they make in the supermarket. And no effort is made to analyze how to develop their preferences, or history, or who determines the range of available choices. Now, placing an event in its real historical and social context, which is to say, studying it dialectically, often leads to conclusions that are the direct opposite of those based on the narrow observation of ideological thinking. As the attempted separation of what cannot be separated without distortion, capitalist ideology reflects in thought the fractured lives of alienated people, while at the same time making it increasingly difficult for them to grasp their alienation. As contradictions of capitalism become greater, more intense, and less amenable to disguise, neither the state nor ideology can restrain the mass of the workers, white and blue collar, from recognizing their interests, that is, from becoming class conscious and acting upon them. The overthrow of capitalism, when it comes, Marx believed, would proceed as quickly and democratically as the nature of capitalist opposition allowed. Out of the revolution would emerge a socialist society which would fully utilize and develop much further the productive potential inherited from capitalism. Through democratic planning, production would now be directed to serving social needs instead of maximizing private profit. The final goal toward which socialist society would constantly build is the human one of abolishing alienation. Marx called the attainment of this goal communism. So within Marx's ideas of workers' alienated labor also lies a theory of value, and I want to just talk about that for a few moments as well. So what is the effect of the workers' alienated labor on its products, both on what they can do and what can be done with them? Smith and Ricardo used the labor theory of value to explain the cost of commodities. We don't have to worry about that too much, but just to inform you about where these ideas are coming from. For them, the value of any commodity is the result of the amount of labor time that went into its production. Now, Marx took his explanation more or less for granted. Now, his labor theory of value, however, is primarily concerned with the more basic problem of why goods have prices of any kind. Only in capitalism does the distribution of what is produced take place through the medium of markets and prices. In a slave society, for example, the slave owners take by force what the slaves produce, returning to them only that which they wish, while in feudalism the lord claims as the feudal right some part of what is produced by his serfs, with the serfs consuming the rest of their output directly. Now, in both societies, most of what is produced cannot be bought or sold, and therefore does not have any price. Now, in accounting for the extraordinary fact that everything produced in capitalist society has a price, Marx emphasizes the separation of the worker from the means of production, whereas slaves and serfs are tied to their means of production in very material ways, and also then from the sale of his or her labor that this separation makes necessary. So to survive, the workers who lack all means to produce must sell their labor power. And in selling their labor power, they give up all claims to the products of their labor. Hence, these products become available for exchange in the market, indeed are produced with this exchange in mind, while workers are able to consume only that portion of their products which they can then buy back in the market, and the wages that they're then paid for the labor power as well. So value is the general effect of the worker's alienated labor on all its products. Exchange, which is embodied in the fact that they all have a price, is what these products do and what can be done with them. Rather than a particular price, value stands for the whole set of conditions which are necessary for a commodity to have any price at all. It is in this sense that Marx calls value a product of capitalism. The ideal price, the exchange value of a commodity, and the ways in which it is meant to be used, the use value, likewise exhibit in their different ways the distinctive relationships Marx uncovered between workers and their activities, products and other people in a capitalist society. Exchange value reflects a situation where the distinct human quality and variety of work has ceased to count. Through alienation, the relations between workers has been reduced to the quantity of labor that goes into their respective products. Only then can these products exchange for each other at a ratio which reflects these quantities. It is this which explains Smith's and Ricardo's finding that the value of a commodity is equal to the amount of labor time which has gone into its production. While in use value, the physical characteristics of commodities, planned obsolescence, the attention given to style over durability, the manufacture of individual and family as opposed to larger group units, all of these things, give unmistakable evidence of the isolating and degrading quality of human relations found through capitalist society. So surplus value, which is the third aspect of value, is the difference between the amount of exchange and use value created by workers and the amount returned to them as wages. The capitalist buys the worker's labor power, as in any other commodity, and puts it to work for 8 or more hours a day. However, workers can make in, say, 5 hours products which are the equivalent of their wages. In the remaining 3 or more hours, an amount of wealth is produced which remains in the hands of the capitalists. That's a break-even point. The capitalist control over this surplus is the basis of their power over the workers and the rest of society. Marx's labor theory of value also provides a detailed account of the struggle between capitalists and workers over the size of the surplus value, with the capitalists trying to extend the length of the working day, speed up the pace of work, etc., while the workers organized to protect themselves. Because of the competition amongst capitalists, workers are constantly being replaced by machinery, enabling and requiring capitalists to extract ever greater amounts of surplus values from the workers who remain. Now the paradox is this: the amount of surplus value is also the source of capitalism's greatest weakness. Because only part of their product is returned to them as wages, the workers cannot buy a large portion of the consumables that they produce. Under pressure from the constant growth of the total product, the capitalists periodically fail to find new markets to take up the slack. Now this leads to crises of overproduction, capitalism's classic contradiction. It is the biggest issue in Marxism in this sense, in which people are then forced to live on too little because they actually produce too much. So in this next section, I want to turn to a couple of points that I've introduced through Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, that is about class and ideology, and it introduced an idea of hegemony that I'm taking from Antonio Gramsci. So Antonio Gramsci was very interested in notions of the state and civil society, and that is, what is the relation of the individual and groups to the state, that is the political structure of society, and how is leadership formulated in class-based systems. And he offered a few important changes within Marxist theory that I want us to just think about for a few minutes. First of all, in relation to class, he takes the concept from Marx, but makes some really subtle distinctions within the concept. So he understands and works through a concept of historical materialism that he takes from Karl Marx, but he maintains a focus on subjugated classes, that is, the subaltern classes, as he calls them. Now, the subaltern, really the history of it is as a military origin, and it's a junior officer in the military, but in social theory, it's really somebody from a group that constitutes an inferior rank or an inferior station. And it's really been taken up in post-colonial theory as a racial group that has experienced systematized inferior treatment historically. So Antonio Gramsci is asking in this history of the subaltern classes, what are the condition of the subaltern classes and how does change occur for them? Now, Gramsci redefines class through a notion of interest, and so he's really taking a step beyond Marx in the sense that Marx is really thinking about a dual system in which two classes struggle for power over the course of history. And Gramsci takes up a notion of interest that he intervenes in Marx in a particular way through doing so. Now, Gramsci argues that the ruling classes are not united with the state, and this is one of the places where he's different from Marx here. Their interests are not always the same, that is, the ruling classes in the state. And they're no longer able to rule through direct and coercive power, but now must depend on other groups. So Gramsci's writing in a different historical time from Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels as well. They were writing in the 19th century, and Gramsci's writing in the first half of the 20th century. And so a lot of the things from the Industrial Revolution had really changed by the beginning of the 20th century, and new forms of capitalism and new tentacles of capitalism, new groups that constitute power within the society have been forming as well. And so Gramsci's reorienting his thoughts around notions of interest in order to encapsulate the way that those people articulate power historically as well. So in a former period, the absolute monarchy is able to use power as force. And the ruling classes then, by the end of the 19th century, they must rule a lot more generously because power is distributed in new kinds of ways by then. And then by the 20th century, groups are no longer able to rule singularly. They must rule in what Gramsci refers to as the power block. That is, they have to have a sense of coalition politics. And if you understand anything about Italian politics, where even today their parliament is many political parties that must rule together in order to maintain power, you can understand where he's coming from. But the power block defines basically how groups with similar interests align to rule. And this happens by combining political or social groups to form power in any historical moment. So that's the idea of coalition and power blocks. On the point of ideology, Gramsci asks, as did Karl Marx, what is ideology? And of course there are many meanings to this historically, but commonly it's really accepted as a system of ideas, and it's a system of ideas that is shared by a group. Now, it originated as a thought within a science of ideas, and groups then are groups that share ideologies are aligned through their sharing of ideas. So Gramsci argues that these cut across traditional class lines under capitalism. So class alone is not sufficient to understand forms accurately and completely. Ideology then connects groups and forms them collectively into the power block. So, for example, a grouping that forms power based on shared ideas then rather than some other feature. Now, historically, that would have been property ownership. So if thinking about the power block means that Gramsci has to come up with a more subtle way of thinking about class within his theorization, then how does ideology function for Gramsci? And this is a real important difference for his work from Marx as well. Now, ideology has various meanings historically, but it's commonly accepted as a system of ideas that are shared by a group. So any group that comes together around a single idea or a grouping of ideas will share an ideology between them. So groups that share ideologies are aligned for Gramsci, and of course for Marx as well. Now, Gramsci argues that these cut across traditional class lines under capitalism, and so this is where he really marks his difference from Karl Marx. So class alone then is not sufficient to understand these forms accurately and completely. Ideology for Gramsci connects groups and forms them collectively into the power block. So for example, it forms power based on shared ideas rather than some other feature. So for example, what we've been looking at is property ownership. Property ownership under Gramsci's idea of ideology doesn't produce the same singularity that it did in Marx. There are other ways of having to come together in the power block for Gramsci. And so again, it's a more subtle kind of way of thinking about this. Now, that doesn't mean that they don't include class elements. They can, but they also include elements that are shared across different ideological formations that are not absolutely determined by class. So Gramsci then adds this really important layer to Marxist analysis. The power block is not the same as the ruling class. It's not shared, it's not formed by a shared identity or a singular class position, for example, the monarchy or aristocracy or the middle class. So it's not shared by or not formed by a shared identity. There are other elements that must be included in it. So if you think, for example, parents of school-age children, they share the issue of schooling and parenting together. Or elderly people share the issue of elder care. So what does care look like later in life? Or youth share sometimes the issue of unemployment as an issue that cuts across all kinds of class lines, but is shared by this group of people at the same time. So the power block operates by bringing those people that share ideas together to basically get more critical mass for the issues that they're dealing with. Now, Gramsci adds a further layer to this, which is really important, and that's the idea of hegemony. Hegemony is often misunderstood. It's often thought of as simple top-down power. People will say hegemony as a direct analogy for power itself. And I would say at the very end of the day, it is like that. But there's a really important element to this that I want to explain because it allows us a much more subtle thinking of hegemony through Gramsci. So this is the concept, hegemony, that Gramsci is most known for. Now, the power block, or the historic block as it's sometimes called, it cannot rule by force. So it's different than it was historically as well. The power block knows that it can lose power. All that is required is a realignment of interests for any power block to lose power. So it can lose power by force, or it can also lose power by the realignment of interests themselves. So hegemony develops as a form of power that reworks force into consent. So we must form alliances, and when we form alliances within this power dynamic, we must compromise on issues simultaneously. And hegemony defines this form. Power is maintained not by force, but by consent. Hegemony then is not synonymous with power then. People not know that power operates upon them, but they agree to it. And they agree to it because they understand that their interests will be served by power. So that's a really important distinction. People recognize that power must be oppressive overall, but they also get something from power. Now, what could that be? Well, in any society, they will get the rule of law, they will get an idea of the good life, or they'll get forms of protection and other things as well. But those, I think, are really key ones. And so they'll consent to other forms of oppression in order to take the privilege that reduced freedom provides. And that's what hegemony captures. So ultimately it is top-down power, especially for those at the lower registers of the social order. But it's also more insidious because the oppressed agree to being oppressed because they receive certain kinds of privileges from it. So I want to think about that as we move through the readings today and move through the exercises for today as well. So please go ahead and do the readings for today, the Marx and Engels reading and the Antonio Gramsci reading, and then watch the video where I describe the exercises. Thanks very much.